Chapter 30. The Battle of Kini Nui. 6 minutes after the Toa's descent. A wave of silence swept through the army of Matoran as the Toa made their descent into the entrance to Makuta's lair. The pathway that had remained sealed for more than a century was now a gaping portal into a howling abyss. Tension was high, as years of prophecies were now being fulfilled before their eyes. Yet all depended on the success of the Toa, and the Matorans' ability to ensure they reached their destination uninterrupted. More than 1,300 Matoran of all races were gathered together at Kini Nui to secure its defense. Takua was among them despite having never killed an infected Rahi in his life. He felt he had no right to exclude himself from the battle after playing such an integral part in making it possible. Though he had no formal weapons or combat training, he was still fully committed to his duty. He was terrified. Terrified not only for his own safety, but the safety of the numerous familiar masks he had come to know over the last month. He could see Maku among the crowd, standing beside Huki, who appeared much different than when he last saw him. He stood boldly and strong among his fellow guards. His chest and upper limbs were fitted with bulky external armor made of iron, which matched the heavy battle axe he wielded. Takua also saw Damek among the mounted Ussel riders, as well as Tepu, who stood crabless and equipped with nothing but a pickaxe. Creating a heavy contrast among the hardy Po-Matoran warriors such as Piatra and Ali was Hafu, who despite regularly maintaining a pompous and cocksure attitude back in Pokoro, was clearly afraid as well. On the outskirts of the crowd were more than 100 Gukko hitched beside their pilots, and there was hardly a single Ta-Matoran he didn't recognize. The silence hung in the air for several minutes, making the ever-growing anticipation swell with every passing second. With the Toa departed, the Matoran now waited for what was to come next. Soon a sprinkle of soft whispers were heard before the multicolored crowd parted, making way for Captain Jalla to walk through. He ascended the steps of the upper temple, followed by Kongu, Huki, Pakasta, Kai, and Onepu. Once they stopped just beside the opened entrance, Jala gave a sweeping glance through the grassy valley. Aside from the sea of fear-stricken yet brave Matoran scattered throughout the area, the sacred temple grounds were littered with heavy artillery, hastily constructed watchtowers, and walls made of spiked logs around the perimeter. It became clear they were as prepared as they would ever be.
"Gathered friends!"
Jalla called out, addressing the crowd as he began to pace around the entrance.
"For more than 100 years we've remained scattered, isolated, and weak. And for more than 100 years our enemy has used that weakness against us. That ends today. Today, we stand not as 6 villages, but one island of brothers and sisters in mended unity, joined together as we carry out this duty to achieve a shared destiny. In recent days, we have seen greater victories than any that have come before in all the years on this island. And the greatest of these will be seen today. So long as when the forces of evil descend, we hold our ground. We will fight to the last Matoran before a single sickly beast breaches that gate. The Toa have their mission, and we have ours. I say all of this awake to the chance that I may die today. But I tell the truth that there is no greater day to die than today. Should I die today, I will die knowing I died standing, sword drawn, defying the enemy to the last breath. Should I die today, I will die among the company of the bravest and most honorable Matoran to ever set foot on the shores of this island. Should I die today, I will die delighted that for perhaps the first time in our history, Makuta has tasted fear! So should I die today, my conscience will be clean, but my blade will be stained!
Jalla thrust his sword into the air, summoning an earth-shattering chorus of battle cries from every corner. When the commotion died down, the silence returned for only a moment before a steady rumble was heard beyond the valley. The sound of hundreds of hooves, paws, and talons marching from all directions in an ever-tightening circle toward the temple.
I can't tell if that's the sound of the Rahi approaching,
Kongu said as the rumble grew closer, causing all of Kini Nui to rattle.
or the sound of Makuta's knees clack knocking together.
Mount your bird, Captain,
Jala said as he watched toward the distant hill.
They're here.
Kongu rushed off, rallying the other Gukko pilots to join him. Jala and the remaining captains formed a circle around the entrance, covering every vantage point as they gripped their weapons in anticipation. The advancing army of beasts peeked over the hills, peering down at the gathered Matoran as more of their numbers continued to move in. Infected Rahi of all species surrounded the Matoran, overlooking the landscape with countless pairs of penetrating green eyes. Their marching ceased, and the creatures stood in silence as they eyed their target, the entrance to Makuta's lair. Their master was in trouble, and they prepared to come to his aid as they sized up the 1,300 Matoran that stood in their way.
Captain Picasta,
Jala said.
Let them know we're ready for them.
Without a word, the Matoran captain raised his bow, pulling an arrow from his quiver as he took aim. Drawing the string against his dark gray noble huna, he locked onto his target, a large male Kane Ra that stood at the edge of the hill among the front row of beasts. His ice blue eyes narrowed as he made direct eye contact with his target from across the field. He emptied his lungs and released the string, sending the arrow arching over the heads of the Matoran as it found its target despite the great distance. The arrow struck the dead center of the Kane Ra's naturally furrowed brow, ringing as it snapped against the impact. The unharmed Rahi shook its head in irritation at the minor discomfort the shot had caused. The Kane Ra puffed its chest, blasting a roar of rage, which caused a chain reaction of roars, shrieks, croaks, and hisses that made the Matoran battle cries sound like whimpers by comparison. The Rahi charged, rushing down toward the Matoran. The Gukko force took flight from their position, lifting off toward the oncoming stampede. As the Rahi bounded down into the valley, the Matoran fired a hail of arrows that darkened the sky against their attackers. Each arrow found a home, with many piercing the charging beasts at random. Those that were struck fell to the ground, tumbling into the grass before being trampled and left behind. The larger of the charging Rahi, such as the Kane Ra, simply plowed through their downed allies, while the more nimble of the bunch weaved around them. Despite dozens dropping dead along the way, the Rahi never slowed their charge. The Matoran fired the catapults, hurling boulders into the rushing flood of Rahi. The boulders struck their targets, obliterating all that were unfortunate enough to be caught beneath their trajectory. Yet the Rahi kept charging still. Only when they reached the sharpened logs barricading the perimeter were they forced to slow, giving the Matoran clearer shots against them as they worked to smash through the obstacle. The Nui Rama and Nui Kopen flew over the barricades while the Kane Ra, Muaka, and Tarakava began to smash them down. The Matoran did all they could to thin their ranks, but more Rahi continued to pour over the hills even as they broke down the barricades, removing all that stood between them and the Matoran. The opposing forces clashed, resulting in a deafening mess of violence. Arrows and bolts were fired in all directions, riddling the hides of the relentless beasts. Claws were swiped, splintering shields and demolishing the temporary wooden structures. Blades were swung, hacking, cutting, slashing, and stabbing away at legs, tails, wings, pinchers, and necks. The Matoran fired rounds of ballistae, skewering even the larger Rahi. The Gukko that were not already preoccupied with tearing apart the Nui Rama that swarmed the sky were carrying baskets loaded with boulders before releasing them above the heads of the Rahi that continued to charge down the hill. For every Rahi that was slain, more took their place. The Rahi shifted their focus toward the artillery. The Onu-Matoran constructed machines had proven successful in taking down numerous large Rahi, which made them the new primary targets. They only briefly gave the Matoran openings for attack as the Rahi's main focus was elsewhere. But when targeted directly by the opposing army, the catapults and ballistae stood little chance before being dismantled by dozens of horns, claws, and teeth. With most of these obstructions destroyed, the Rahi now turned their attention toward the watchtowers. Captain Onepu led a small band of Ussel riders as they battled against the group of Makika consisting of both jungle and desert species. The desert Makika were little challenge for the heavily armed Ussel as they were quickly picked off one by one. The larger jungle Makika posed a greater threat, engaging in combat with the crabs. A well-placed crossbow bolt was enough to remove each toad from the fight, but more kept coming as they were forced to stop and reload. While Onepu and his crab were preoccupied fighting off a pair of jungle Makika, a desert Makika leaped behind him and snagged his arm with its prehensile tongue. Onepu cried out as the acidic saliva hissed against his armor before yanking him off his crab. He slammed against the ground, working to turn himself around as the Rahi dragged him closer. He used his crossbow bolt to stab into the tongue. The Makika released its hold, allowing Onepu to climb to his feet. The intense burning sensation seeping into his still sizzling upper arm limited his movement, causing him to struggle to load the bolt into his crossbow. Before the weapon was loaded, a second Makika joined the first, adding greater pressure to his already dire task. The other Ussel riders were all engaged in their own fights, forcing him to hold his ground on his own. The bolt was nearly loaded before the Makika were ready to pounce. Before they leaped forward, they were flanked by Tepu charging in to Onepu's rescue. He plunged his pickaxe into the eye of the first Makika, spraying the potent green mist into his face. As the dead Rahi fell to the ground, he strained to remove the embedded tool from its skull. Quickly realizing he was spending too much time, he abandoned the pickaxe and rushed toward the second Makika before it could reach Onepu. He dropped low as he ran, tackling the second Makika and lifting it off the ground before slamming it onto its back. He wrestled the giant toad as they both tore at each other's armor with their claws. Tepu found a small chunk of one of the boulders dropped by the Gukko lying on the ground beside them. He punched the Makika's jaw, freeing up the time to grab the rock. As the Rahi recovered, Tepu had already begun bludgeoning it with the underside of the rock. The Makika croaked as its armored head was slowly caved in by Tepu's repeated strikes. Tepu pulled back as the now mutilated and deformed toad fell dead. He panted for breath as he tossed the broken rock to the side before frantically turning to check on his captain.
Tepu, I believe mining to be a waste of your talents,
Onepu said as he inspected the gruesome aftermath. On the other end of the valley, Takua sprinted across the battlefield, offering aid to all he could. The screams of Matoran rang out from all around him, followed by roars and screeches nearly drowning them out. Just ahead was a Matoran guard standing over a slain Nui Rama. He had been too focused on confirming his kill that he failed to notice the giant six-legged spider creeping up from behind him until its shadow hung over him. Takua rushed toward him as he turned around to find himself at the mercy of a Fiku Nui, the largest subspecies of Fiku spider on the island, and the only type under Makuta's control. Its jet-black body stood elevated from the ground, propped up by its spindly 9-foot legs. The Matoran barely had time to raise his spear when the giant spider unfurled its fangs and bore them into his neck. The guard's body convulsed, dropping his spear as he weakly struggled to pull its teeth from his neck. The Fiku Nui slowly lifted his body off the ground as it forced its teeth in tighter, causing a stream of silver and crimson marbled circulatory fluid to pour from his neck. Although Takua had reached the Matoran, there was little he could do. The Po Matoran's body dangled loosely just as the Fiku Nui crunched clean through his neck. Takua turned his head in horror as the dead Po Matoran's body dropped to the ground. The Fiku Nui then noticed Takua. It slowly crept toward him, kicking the head out of its path as it prepared to snap again. Takua glanced toward the discarded spear, which was too far to even attempt to reach. Takua inched backward in hopes of creating enough space to run, but the giant spider only followed him. The Fiku Nui twitched its fangs before its attention was drawn away from its prey when it noticed Jalla charging forward. It crawled toward the captain, chomping down at him as he rushed in. Jalla deflected the bite with his sword before sliding feet first below its legs. He rolled to his side to avoid the Rahi's legs as it tried to stomp him into the ground. He sprang to his feet, hacking off its middle left leg. The Fiku Nui screeched, stumbling and fighting to maintain its balance. Jala dodged another stomping attempt before severing its back right leg, quickly followed by its front left. He rushed out from beneath its body, taking off its middle left leg along the way. The Rahi fell to the ground, reaching and prodding at the captain with its remaining legs before he drove his sword deep into its mouth. He twisted the blade before wrenching it free, flinging a spray of fluids from the wound as the green gas escaped its eyes. Jala turned toward Takua, who was still in shock from the sight of the dead Po Matoran.
You're all right, Takua. Stick beside me if you don't want that to change.
The Rahi continued to flood in from the hills. A cluster of Onu Matoran worked alongside a squad of Sanctum guards to eliminate a Tarakava that had demolished one of the watchtowers. They surrounded it from all directions and began pelting it with arrows until it was weakened enough to approach with spears. Once the final blow was dealt, their victory was short-lived. They looked out to see even the larger Rahi parting out to create a path for a long stream of dark, skittering movement to flow into the valley. At first, the Matoran were unable to identify it, but as it drew closer, the thousands of tiny green glowing specks became clear.
"Kofo Jaga!"
called one of the Onu Matoran.
"Quickly! Get across the stream!"
The group of more than 20 Matoran fled the Tarakava carcass and made their way across the rushing stream dividing the two halves of Kini Nui. They shouted out to all other Matoran in the vicinity, urging them to do the same. The Matoran leaped into the water, nearly being pulled away by the current. They struggled to stay on course as they swam to the other side. Those near the rear had nearly reached the stream as the Kofo Jaga quickly gained on them. The last Onu Matoran was mere feet away from the stream when he was stopped in his tracks by a sudden and all-consuming assault of agony in his lower leg. He screamed in pain, limping toward the stream as more Kofo Jaga clung to his body. His movements were slowed with each unforgiving attack until he was forced to the ground, still screaming as his body was completely coated in the tiny scorpion Rahi. After several seconds of thrashing and rolling, his screams croaked away, and he fell still as the Kofo Jaga vacated his body before joining the rest of the swarm toward the stream. Huki was joined by a group of his Pokoro guards as they faced off against a Nui Jaga. Having faced dozens of the giant scorpion Rahi native to his home in the past, Huki charged forward. The Nui Jaga hissed, thrusting its stinger forward, which Huki deflected with the blade of his giant axe. The force of the blow caused him to stumble, but he quickly recovered in time to duck below a snapping pincher. With the Nui Jaga distracted by their captain, the other Pokoro guards armed with grapnel ropes tossed them over the Nui Jaga's back. The hooks wrapped around its stinger tail while more Po Matoran rushed in to secure a grip on the ropes. At first, the Nui Jaga was too strong to be subdued, continuing to pursue Huki. Soon, other nearby Matoran quickly joined in securing the ropes, pulling against the might of the Rahi's tail until it was forced still by more than 15 Matoran villagers. Huki charged forward, dodging the first snap of its pincers and blocking the second. He spun around, gaining the momentum to swing his axe into the Rahi's face. Huki dodged another involuntary swipe of its pincher before it collapsed into the grass. Takua followed behind the captain as they both worked toward assisting all they came across. Finding themselves in an open patch of the field, Jala was forced to halt as a growing cluster of bog snakes slithered toward them. Also known as kuna, the bog snakes were venomous serpents native to the Phao swamp in Liwahi. They each measured more than 12 feet in length and possessed a single fang on their lower jaw. Jala readied his sword as the swarm of 40 snakes made their way toward him. He had battled these creatures numerous times in the past, but he had never faced them in such great numbers.
Get out of here, Takua. I'll have to catch up later.
The first snake struck. Jala leaned away to avoid the strike before following up with a strike of his own, severing its head. The second strike came from his right side. He grabbed the Rahi by its throat and tossed it back as he slashed the head off a third attacking from his left. He dodged, ducked, and deflected strike after strike, each one becoming closer to landing than the last. He hacked and sliced until his arm was caught in a perpetual rhythm. The growing pile of headless snakes coiled and strewn around his feet had made his maneuvers increasingly difficult, causing his reactions to slow. Takua watched from a distance, where he noticed one of the snakes approaching Jala from behind, who seemed unaware of its presence. Takua's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to warn the captain. Calling out to him would do little against the commotion of the raging battle. He needed to act on his own. He glanced down, finding a discarded Pomatoran tomahawk lying on the ground beside his feet. He scooped the weapon from the ground and sprinted toward the captain. The bog snake had already begun to rear back. Jala had noticed it, but was unable to react as he was too preoccupied with the other remaining snakes that crowded around him. Unable to reach the snake in time, Takua was forced to trust his unpracticed aim and flung the axe toward the Rahi just as it pounced. The blade struck the bog snake's head as it was mere inches from burying its fang into Jala's neck, killing it instantly. Jala finished off the final snake before turning toward Takua.
Thanks. Where did you learn to throw an axe like that?
I've never done that before.
Takua replied, awestruck by the luck of the throw.
It was a solid throw.
I meant I never killed a Rahi before.
Jala was only mildly surprised by Takua's claim. He glanced around the battlefield before retrieving the tomahawk from the ground and tossing it back to the chronicler.
Don't make it your last. Come on.
The Gukko force took to the skies, engaging in battle with the swarm of Nui Rama and Nui Kopen that plagued the airspace. Since the Battle of Liwahi, the Nui Rama population had dropped drastically in the area, though other nests still remained on the island. But despite their fewer numbers, the Matoran had a much harder time fighting individually without the aid of Toa Liwa to weaken them. Kongu soared across the battlefield, tearing through any Nui Rama that were foolish enough to challenge them. As Ka snuffed out the flying Rahi, Kongu took frequent breaks in steering to fire a few arrows toward the Rahi on the ground. He steered Ka toward the battle, snatching a sand Tarakava and carrying it into the air before dropping it to the ground. The impact wounded the beast long enough for those on the ground to finish it off.
Ever nice work, old boy.
Kongu called, patting the Kahu's neck.
If we do that 100 more times, we may have a good luck chance at winning this fight.
Kongu pulled Ka upward and began searching for another target. He spotted a smaller Nui Jaga battling a group of Ga Matoran. Deciding that to be his next target, he flew toward it. Before he reached it in time, Ka was struck from below by a Nui Kopen. The impact veered Ka off course, causing him to roll sideways. Kongu was ejected from the saddle and sent plummeting to the ground below. His fall was broken when he landed on the back of a Nui Rama, which was enraged at the sudden impact. Kongu had managed to keep a hold of a single arrow during his ejection, which he plunged into the back of the Nui Rama's neck. The Rahi twitched and sputtered before nosediving into the valley. The crash sent Kongu tumbling and rolling gracelessly along the ground. Scuffed and shaken from the landing, he groaned in pain as he pushed himself onto his feet. After wiping the dirt and grass from his body, he looked up to find himself in the sights of Akuma Nui, the gigantic rodents that haunted the caves of Onuwahi. The beast stalked forward, digging its claws into the dirt as it approached the Lematoran. Kongu readied his bow, only to remember his quiver of arrows was still fastened to Ka's saddle. With little options, he tossed the bow to the ground and threw up his fists as a final act of defiance against the Rahi.
Right then.
Kongu said as the monstrous beast twitched its tail.
Let's make this swift quick.
Just as the Kuma Nui struck, Ka swooped down from the sky, slashing the giant rodent and knocking it onto its back. The two titanic beasts grappled along the ground, tearing out chunks of dirt as they scratched and clawed away at each other. Ka hooked his beak onto the Kuma Nui's chest, tearing open its mechanical components and ripping into whatever he found beneath. The Kuma Nui fell dead, and Ka hopped down from its chest, unsteadily wobbling as he found his balance. He looked over toward Kongu, shaking off his damaged wings before stomping toward him.
Ka! Incoming!
Before he could reach his master, Ka was suddenly pounced from behind by a muwaka. Ka shrieked as the feline beast sank its teeth into his wing. He pulled himself free, sending a shower of violet feathers spraying into the air. Ka batted the muwaka with his other wing, knocking it back. He leaped forward, snapping his beak in hopes of finishing it off in the same way he did the Kuma Nui. Before he could reach it, a second muwaka joined the fight, attacking Lowe and jerking Ka's leg from beneath him.
Ka! Get out of there!
Forced onto his side, Ka was left defending himself against the two muwaka with his single uninjured leg, wing, and beak. The first muwaka attempted to claw at his throat, but he managed to catch its paw in his mouth before crunching through the bones of its foreleg. The muwaka growled, hopping back as it tucked its injured foot up into its chest before leaping back forward. Ka swatted the second muwaka away with his good wing, only to leave his shoulder exposed to another bite from the first. Ka screeched, rolling over the top of the muwaka that just attacked him, putting the infected Rahi in the prime position to skewer from the side. Just before the muwaka succumbed to the wound, it lashed out, clawing out Ka's right eye. Kongu frantically called out to his bird, unable to get close enough to the fight.
Fall back! Ka!
Ka was unable to stand. He faced off against the second muwaka, now joined by a third, by pulling himself forward with his less injured wing. Ka shook his head, brushing off his injuries before giving a final, shrieking cry of dissent. Both muwaka pounced simultaneously. Ka swatted away the first, just before being tackled to the ground by the second. The muwaka slashed against Ka's armor, trailing deep across his chest. Ka continued to fight even as the other muwaka joined the mauling. With what little strength remained, Ka secured the throat of one of the beasts and tore it out. The final muwaka retaliated by sinking its teeth into Ka's own throat. With his one remaining eye, Ka glanced over toward Kongu one last time. Once his movements had slowed enough to satisfy the muwaka, it bounded away in search of its next scuffle before even noticing Kongu. Kongu sprinted toward the downed Kahu before dropping to his knees, overwhelmed and tormented by the sight. Ka's expression of pain and exertion turned calm as he felt Kongu's hand stroke the feathers on his soaked neck. With a labored exhale, Ka's breath slowed to a halt, and the red light drained from his eye.
Goodbye, old friend. Thank you for everything.
The Rahi army pressed forward, pushing the Matoran back toward the entrance. Every small victory the Matoran achieved was rendered meaningless when more Rahi appeared to join the fight. Still, the Matoran fought on, keeping their promise to not allow a single beast through the entrance. Kai led a large group of Ga Matoran through the battlefield, bringing down countless large Rahi with their combined efforts. They had successfully slain Nakane Ra with the help of a group of Ta Matoran and Onu Matoran. Before searching for their next target, the sounds of battle were smothered by a blaring roar blasting from beyond the hills. Kai gripped her spear as her eyes snapped toward the direction of the call. The trees surrounding the valley beyond the hilltop swayed as an exceptionally large creature burst through the clearing and bounded down the hill. Its sheer size was unmistakable. It was the very same Rahi that plagued the Ga Matoran captain's memories for decades. The Tarakava Nui. It was more than twice the size of any other Tarakava ever seen on the island, and had sported deep scarring along the mechanical components of its face and side since Ka's last encounter with it. Kai charged forward before even considering ordering her guards to join her. Noticing where she was headed, they joined behind her, followed by more than a dozen Ta Matoran. The Tarakava Nui bounded toward the temple, indiscriminately swatting away both Matoran and Rahi that stood in its path. Po Matoran guards tossed their grapnel hooks, hooking into the Rahi's side, only to be yanked off the ground and dragged along the grass. Onu Matoran Ussel riders fired their crossbows into its side in an attempt to slow it down, but it hardly seemed to notice. More grapnel hooks were thrown, arrows fired, and spears hurled, all of which had little effect on the Tarakava Nui. Kai thrust her spear into the Rahi's shoulder, only for it to pull it out and snap it in two between its claws. Now armed with only a dagger in her sharpened hook hand, Kai ducked under its long, sweeping arm before moving even closer.
She's going to get herself killed!
Exclaimed one of the Ta Matoran.
We need more Matoran!
Cried another. Gakko pilots swooped down toward the fight, dropping boulders down onto the Tarakava Nui's back, creating a distraction that allowed Kai to sink her dagger into its exposed muscle tissue. The beast shrieked, effortlessly swatting Ka away. She was sent soaring through the air, slamming down and tumbling through the field. The other Matoran charged toward the Rahi, firing more arrows and tossing spears. The Tarakava Nui grew increasingly agitated by the inconveniences. It swiped an unfortunate Ta Matoran from the ground and tossed him into its mouth before he had the chance to react. More Matoran joined in, including Gakko birds dropping more boulders. The Pokoro guards continued to toss their grapnel ropes, aiming primarily at its long forelimbs and thinned tail. The creature fought and thrashed, sending Matoran hurtling in every direction, but they continued to press on. Every time a boulder was dropped, the Lee Matoran would circle back with another one and repeat the attack. Soon the Tarakava Nui was stunned long enough for the Po Matoran to toss more ropes over its armored hide. It reached out to swat at the Ga Matoran that hurled spears at its face, but its arms were tangled and bound, rendering it immobile. Still, the Matoran were forced to keep their distance as they strained to maintain their hold on the ropes to avoid its snapping jaws. The guards secured the ropes by driving stakes into the ground to fasten them in place, all while still tossing more ropes over its back. Although the Tarakava Nui was now secured, no Matoran dared get close enough to finish it off. The battle with the Tarakava Nui had required far too many Matoran, causing the temple's overall defense to slip. The advancing Rahi charged toward the entrance, getting closer than ever. The Matoran fought on, making every effort to drive the Rahi back, but only succeeded in stalling their approach. In an attempt to intercept Akane Ra, a Sanctum guard was skewered by its horns. A Ga Matoran was blinded by Nui Jaga venom, only for her screams to attract a Muwaka to finish her off. A Lee Matoran ground fighter tried his best to shake off the bite of a Nia Vo, but ultimately failed to remain standing, leaving him at the mercy of Akuma Nui. Takua stuck by Jalla's side, but was frozen in place by the sight of the wounded, dead, and dying Matoran that littered the battlefield. The sounds of fear and despair were far more prevalent than the roars and screeches of the infected Rahi. Their defeat was imminent, and pressing on would only senselessly cost more lives. He felt wholly responsible for all the suffering that occurred all around him, for he was the one that convinced the strongest and bravest of all Matoran to throw their lives away, regardless of the intent. Takua turned to see a Muwaka stalking toward him. He raised his scavenged tomahawk as Jala rushed to his side with his sword raised. The Muwaka let out a deep, rumbling growl as it bore its teeth at the Matoran standing less than 10 feet away.
Final stand?
Takua asked.
We'll see,
Jala replied. Before it could strike, it was suddenly struck. Jala and Takua failed to see where the strike came from, but noticed the Rahi throwing its paws over its face as it twitched its ears in discomfort. As the Muwaka was distracted, they looked around to see every single infected Rahi on the battlefield seemed to be suffering from the same affliction. Curious, Takua took a cautious step toward the Muwaka for a closer look. The Rahi looked up, slowly stepping toward Takua until its breath nearly knocked him off balance. It studied the odd Matoran with its beaming yellow eyes as it sniffed his armor from mask to foot. After his assessment, it shoved Takua to the ground with a nudge of its snout. Jala rushed forward, coming to Takua's defense as he swiped his blade toward its face. The Muwaka hissed, startled by the more aggressive Matoran's display. Before Jala could achieve a proper strike, the giant cat turned and darted off toward the hills. Jala glanced around the valley, finding all other Rahi displaying similar behavior.
What just happened?
Takua asked as he climbed to his feet. Jala stood watching in disbelief as the infected Rahi began abandoning their attack one by one.
The Toa did it. The Rahi are free.
As the green drained from their eyes, the Matoran watched as thousands of cured Rahi began to return to their natural habits. Some remained somewhat aggressive. Others seemed to lose interest in the fight and began to wonder, while some appeared terrified and began to flee into the hills. With their victory almost fully secured, the Matoran army raised their weapons, driving away the remaining Rahi. Kai had finally recovered from her tumble just as the battle came to a close. She drew her knife and rushed back toward the captured Tarakava Nui. For decades, the foul beast haunted her dreams and every waking thought. She had dedicated a great portion of her life to avenging her crew and getting payback for the loss of her hand, and now that chance was staring back at her mere feet away. She raised her knife, preparing to plunge it into the Tarakava Nui's eyes. She was aware such an attack would hardly be enough to kill the large Rahi right away, but she had every intention to savor the task. She looked into the glowing orange eyes of the Tarakava Nui, finding what once beamed with malice and hate, now displayed fear and sadness. She held the knife over her head, shaking the creature's expression from her mind, only to take another glance. Kai sighed, tossing the knife into the grass before ordering the surrounding Matoran to cut it free. With the Rahi driven from Kini Nui, the Matoran celebrated their victory. The wounded were safely transported to their villages for medical attention, while the dead were counted and laid to rest at a newly created burial site beside the temple. Of the 1,303 Matoran that fought in the Battle of Kini Nui, 26 lives were lost, all of which died heroically and without regret. But despite the great victory that was achieved on the surface, the battle below was far from over.